I'm recording this on my laptop. The battery's at 11% and I can't find the charger, which is fine. That's fine. I'd rather finish this before it dies than have more time to think about how to say it. The police let me leave the station about 4 hours ago. They were kind, actually. Patient. The detective, her name was Reyes, I think. Detective Reyes. She kept offering me water, and I kept forgetting to drink it. She told me the search and rescue team had found signs of a collapse in the lower passage. She told me it was a tragic accident. She told me, very gently, that they were stopping the active search in 3 days. That the geology made recovery impossible and impractical, and a few other words I stopped hearing. They stopped searching for the bodies 3 days ago. They told me it was a tragic accident, a collapse that buried my friends. But I know they aren't buried. They're still down there, and they're still screaming. I need you to understand that we weren't stupid. I want to be really clear about that. Because every story like this starts with people who seem like they deserved what happened to them. We weren't like that. Keith had been caving for 12 years. He'd done systems in New Mexico, in Slovenia, in a karst formation in southern China that only 3 other foreign nationals had ever been permitted to survey. Sarah had a geology PhD, actually had it framed on her wall. The real kind from a real university and everything. She'd done work on cave formation timelines that got cited in journals I couldn't pronounce. Ben was the cautious one. We used to joke about it. He was the one who triple-checked the ropes, who never went anywhere without a backup light source and a backup for the backup, who once turned a whole trip around because he'd read something concerning about weather patterns 3 counties over. I did logistics, maps, equipment. I'd been on maybe 30 cave systems over 8 years. Nothing as serious as Keith, but I knew what I was doing. We had permits. We had a check-in protocol with someone on the surface. A mutual friend named Diane, who lived 40 minutes from the access point, and had done this kind of surface support before. We had the right gear, enough food for 4 days, and a conservative turnaround protocol that Ben had written up, and that all of us had agreed to in writing, which felt excessive at the time, but doesn't now. The cave system we were surveying was listed as partially explored. Zikaris Mound System, if anyone wants to look it up, though I'd recommend you don't. There were around 4 kilometers of mapped passage, most of it catalogued in the 70s, a few updates in the early 90s. Standard stuff. We were there to do a fresh survey, update the documentation, see if there was anything the older teams had missed with their older technology. Sarah had a survey-grade laser rangefinder that was newer than anything those original teams would have had access to. And Keith had been in touch with a guy at the State Geological Survey who thought the lower passages might connect to an entirely separate system 3 kilometers to the north. It was a real trip with real professional value. I want that to be clear. The first day was textbook. We found what the old maps said we'd find, roughly where they said we'd find it, in roughly the condition you'd expect. Some new growth, a few places where the passage had altered. Minor rockfall. One section that had flooded at some point and left a new calcite layer over everything. Nothing unusual. We ate lunch in a wide section near what the old survey called Chamber 4 and talked about nothing in particular. The way you do when you're in a place that requires concentration and you want to give your brain a rest. I remember Ben was telling a story about a raccoon that had gotten into his car. For the first few hours of day 2, there wasn't anything unusual either. We found the squeeze on the second day, maybe 6 hours in. It was in a low section of the lower passage, just a crack in the wall behind a natural column of flowstone. The kind of formation that looks like a melted pillar, sort of caramel coloured. You'd walk right past it if you weren't paying attention. Keith noticed it. He held up his hand and we all stopped. And I remember watching the flame on his lighter lean sideways, pointing into the crack, drawing air inward, not outward, which meant there was something big on the other side. It wasn't on any of our maps. The crack was about 50 centimetres at its widest, and it took us almost 40 minutes to get through, removing packs, pushing them ahead, pulling ourselves through on our elbows and stomachs. The stone was wet and smelled like something mineral I didn't have a name for. Not unpleasant exactly, more like the smell of a coin held in your hand for too long. I remember being in the tightest part of the squeeze, where the passage compressed around my chest, so I had to exhale completely before I could inch forward, and thinking that this was the most claustrophobic I'd ever felt in my life. Not scared, just aware of how precisely the space accommodated my body, the way a mould accommodates the object pressed into it. The squeeze felt like it went on longer than it should have. I know the physics of tight passages very well. They distort your sense of time, because your world reduces to the next 3 inches of stone in front of your face, and the effort of making your body smaller than it wants to be. But this felt different. It felt like the stone itself was longer than the outside dimensions made possible. I mentioned this to Keith afterwards, and he said he'd felt it too, and then neither of us said anything else about it. We came out into darkness, and Sarah made a sound that I don't have a word for. Not a scream, not even a gasp. Just a sound that someone makes when their brain encounters something it wasn't equipped to handle. It was a chamber, but not a cave chamber. Not in any sense I'd been trained to recognize. The walls were smooth, but they weren't smoothed by water, and they didn't look to be worn. But they were smooth the way a poured surface is smooth. The floor was level and flat. The geometry was all wrong for nature. It was octagonal. I know that sounds like the kind of detail a person adds to make a story sound more dramatic, but I walked the perimeter later and counted, and it had 8 walls of nearly identical length. The ceiling arched overhead at maybe 4 meters. And, in the center of the room, embedded in the far wall, in a way that suggested it had been installed before the room was built around it, was the door. I've tried to describe it to people and failed every time. It looked like the kind of thing you'd find on a nuclear bunker or a ship. A heavy circular blast door with a wheel mechanism in the center, painted military green, though the paint had since oxidized to something close to grey. Around the frame were bolts the size of my fist, riveted plate steel. It was, best we could estimate, somewhere in the neighbourhood of 1/2 metre thick. The thing is, and Sarah could not stop saying this, kept repeating it in a flat voice while she ran her hands over the rock around the frame. The rock was undisturbed. The geological formations around the door hadn't been touched in millions of years. The flowstone growing over the lower hinges had been carbon dated, if I understood her correctly, to a period that predated any possible human construction. The door had been put there, or it had always been there, or time had done something to the order of things that we couldn't account for. We turned the wheel. I want to be honest about something. We knew we shouldn't. Ben said it directly. He said we should go back, document what we'd found, return with the right authorities and the right permissions. He was correct. He was completely correct about this, and we ignored him, and I have to live with that, or whatever I'm doing now, in this room, which might be living. Keith and I got the wheel turning. It hadn't been opened in, we assumed, a very long time, and it resisted. And then something deep in the mechanism released with a sound like a gunshot, and the door swung inward. Inside was a room. A room, not a chamber, and it was furnished. There was a table with 4 chairs. There was a single cot against one wall, with a thin mattress and a folded grey blanket. There was a shelf with canned goods and a small gas burner, and on the table, still faintly steaming, was a kettle. There was a faint ring of condensation beneath it, still wet, the way a kettle looks 30 seconds after you've poured from it. None of us spoke for probably a full minute. Then Ben said, in a very careful voice, "Someone just left." On the desk, I'd missed the desk at first because it was pushed against the same wall as the door. There was a journal. Spiral bound, the cheap kind you get at a pharmacy, the kind with the black marbled cover. And when I picked it up and turned to the first page, I saw Keith's handwriting. I recognised it because Keith had an unusual habit with his lowercase g. He closed it into a figure 8, slightly tilted, the way some people are taught and most forget. I'd seen it on equipment labels, on survey notes, on a birthday card he'd sent me 2 years ago, on the margins of maps he'd annotated during our planning meetings for this exact trip. There was no question about the handwriting. I would have known it in a lineup. I held the journal out to him. His face went through several expressions I don't have names for. He took it. He turned it over in his hands, the way you turn something over when your hands need to be doing something while your mind catches up. Sarah looked at me. Ben looked at the table. No one said anything for long enough that the silence became its own kind of presence. "That's my notebook," Keith said finally, which wasn't quite the right thing to say, because it wasn't his notebook. It was a notebook written in his handwriting that had been in a sealed room none of us had ever entered. But I understood what he meant. He meant that the handwriting was his. The particular shorthand was his. And the implications of that were too large to approach directly. The entries started with something that read like a normal log. Date, time, observations. Then, after an undetermined period, the handwriting became more erratic. There were references to hunger and to sound. One entry read, "Day unknown. Heard us outside. Heard us coming through. We tried to warn them, but the door. If we open it, they'll come in. If we don't." That sentence wasn't finished. The last entry, I'm going to say this exactly as it appeared, because I've tried to summarize it and I can't. It read, "We heard us outside. We heard us coming. We couldn't let us in, but we didn't know how to stop us, so we left the kettle, so we would know we were here. So we would understand before it was too late. And we're still here. We're all still here, inside." At that point, all of the lights went out. All 4 of our headlamps simultaneously, which should have been statistically impossible. It lasted maybe 2 seconds, but it felt much longer. When they came back on, there were 4 more people in the room. I want to tell you they looked like monsters. I want to tell you it was clear immediately what they were. It wasn't. They looked like us. They were us, or some version of us that had been in that room for a very long time, without enough food and without any light and without any way out. Their clothes were the same. Keith's red jacket, Sarah's green one, Ben's grey fleece with the broken zipper he'd been meaning to replace for 3 years. Their faces were our faces, only hollowed in the way that faces get when the body starts consuming itself. They moved at the same time. What happened next? I won't reconstruct this fully. I'm not able to, partly because it was very dark and very fast, and partly because my mind has done something protective to portions of it. I can tell you it wasn't violent in any way that I had vocabulary for. It wasn't a fight. It was more like drowning. The inability to know which way was up. I couldn't tell in the dark which version of Keith was which. At one point, I was holding someone by the collar, and I didn't know if I should let go or hold on, and so I held on. And then I didn't. And then, before I knew it, I was running. I don't know what happened to Sarah. I don't know what happened to Keith. At the blast door, something grabbed my ankle. I kicked. I felt it release. I grabbed the wheel from the inside, from the correct side, and I swung the door shut, and I turned the wheel until I couldn't turn it anymore. And I stood there in the antechamber, listening to sounds I'm not going to describe. You might ask why I did that. Until your life is in mortal danger, you don't know how you'll react. Survival at all costs. When you don't know who to trust, you have to trust no one. I made it back through the squeeze. I made it back through the lower passage. The whole ascent took around 3 hours, and I heard, the entire time, a terrifying sound. Like someone climbing behind me, precise and careful, maintaining exactly the same distance. I never saw anyone when I looked back. I've been trying to stay calm. I've mostly succeeded. I feel like myself. I remember being myself with a completeness and continuity that I can't find any gap in. I remember the specific weight of my pack going through the squeeze, the smell of that mineral stone, the way my headlamp caught the caramel colour of the flowstone column just before I lost sight of it. I remember Ben's face when he said we should go back. I keep returning to Ben's face when he said we should go back. I wish I'd listened. I wish I was the kind of person who listened to Ben. And the reason this specific regret is hard to hold is that I'm not sure anymore whether the person who didn't listen was me. 15 minutes ago, I stood up to use the bathroom. The bathroom has a mirror. There's a mark on my left forearm, about 3 centimeters long, that looks like a scar that's been healing for weeks. I'm certain I have no injury on my left arm. I have no memory of an injury on my left arm. The skin around it is smooth and closed and old. When I press it, it doesn't hurt, which suggests to me that it's an old injury. I pressed it for a long time, standing in the bathroom, looking at myself in the mirror. I looked like me. I looked exactly like me. That's the part I can't get past, that there was no obvious rupture in the reflection. No version of my face that I could point to and say that's wrong, that isn't mine. It just looked like me. And that's either the most reassuring thing in the world or the most frightening. And I've been sitting here for the past 3 hours, trying to determine which. I told the police that I was the only one who made it out. But looking in the mirror, looking at this arm, looking at this face that's so familiar to me, that familiarity itself has started to feel like a symptom, I can't be sure if I'm the one who went in. The battery's at 3%. If anyone hears this, the rock around the door frame hadn't been touched. Sarah said millions of years. But the door was there. The door was always there. I think the door was always there because something knew we were coming, and something had been very patient about it. And I think whatever's in that room doesn't wait. I think it loops. And I think the loop has room for one more version of me. And I think I've been adding a remark to my journal that I don't remember writing. Battery at 2. My name is